My name is Sonya Pemberton, and I'm a filmmaker, a science filmmaker, and I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. I originally studied medicine, and my whole family is medical, but then I decided that I was in the wrong kind of area, and I jumped out to go into journalism and film and television, and I ended up stumbling into science filmmaking. And I worked for WHO and our scientific body called CSIRO. Worked with them for several years, making lots and lots of science films. And I discovered I loved it. And now I make global science documentaries for global audiences, for television, for our ABC, SBS, BBC, National Geographic, things like that. And I really love science and science communication. And I see myself as a science communicator first and a filmmaker second. But I bring those two things together. But I feel very, very fortunate because I'm working in an area that I love very much. I've been invited to speak as a filmmaker who works in science communication. And at my keynote, what I'm really looking forward to sharing is some very personal stories, to be honest, of what it's like to try and make mainstream documentary films for global audiences that engage with really difficult areas of science, where the science is polarized or can be polarized. And I am going to share some specific examples and show some clips. And I'm also going to give some sense of the difficulties we encountered and how we worked around it. And finally, I find that it's useful to give a couple of my top tips. So I've got like 5 top tips about what I've learned from 20 odd years of doing this. And hopefully that might save people some grief if they're ever in a position where they're making science films. The thing that I'm looking forward to talking about in my keynote is about how we use the principles of science to deliver science communication. And by that, I mean we use empirical methods. We test our films. We have a hypothesis that we think this film is communicating X, Y, and Z, but then we test that by a series of screenings and questionnaires. And then we go back and re-edit films sometimes to make sure they do what we are hoping that they will do. And that is to communicate complicated science across ideological divides to people who may not necessarily want to engage with the science. So that's the dilemma, and that's the kind of excitement also of the job. I've never actually attended this conference before, so I'm really looking forward to it. Public communication of science and technology is so very important. We are living at a time where some of the epic stories of our times are stories of science and technology, whether it's genome editing, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's climate. These are all issues that force us, whether we want to or not, to have to deal with science and technology. And our job as communicators of this to the public is vital. And I think it's really, really important that we sit down and thrash some of these things out and try and figure out how we're going to deal with this avalanche of information that is constantly coming our way. How are we going to help the public make sense of this? This is a really important job, really important job. And so I think having a conference that helps us all wrestle with these things is really important. So I'm sure, I mean, I've had a look at the program, and there are so many interesting people coming, and there are so many people I want to learn from. I'm really looking forward to having a chance to sit down with people who will know more than I do about how you deal with triggers, you know, what triggers people to shut down and not listen to you. How do you confront your own bias? What are the tools, the communication tools that work better on different platforms? Yeah, there's a lot to learn, and I'm really looking forward to finding out what other people have to offer. I run a company in Melbourne called Genepool Productions, and we focus on stories of science where the story is polarized, where there is conflict. So, for example, we have made films about vaccines, of course, with a film called Jabbed, and then another film that we made with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute that was called Vaccines Calling the Shots. We made films about uranium, 3x1 hour series on uranium and nuclear everything. We've made films about climate. Our most recent documentary is about carbon. It's called Carbon, the Unauthorized Biography. And that's a pretty radical take on how you might imagine carbon if she could speak. So each of our films is not an educational film, it's a documentary. And because it has to reach millions of people, and on average, our films reach about 10 million people per film over about 10 years, sometimes more. Because of that, we have to be very, very aware of the engagement and, dare I say, entertainment factor, as well as the scientific integrity. And that's the thing I love more than anything, is finding a way to communicate something really, really complicated and make it look deceptively simple, but also take people on a ride so they have fun. So, for example, in uranium, of all things, we visualized uranium by the use of dragons, animated dragons. And it's quite beautiful and quite unusual. And then in carbon, we brought carbon's story alive by making her as if she were a woman, a human woman, and telling the story of her epic life. The most difficult part of my job is what I call crossing the divide. And that is trying to speak to people who may not necessarily agree with what I think or what scientists think, people who may disagree or dislike or distrust science. We aim our films at a broad general audience, and I deliberately try to engage people who have opposing views. That makes filmmaking incredibly difficult. And, you know, I teach my team here all the time, you know, we have little stickers. We have little stickers on our computers that say, what if I'm wrong? What if my scientific expert is wrong? Because science changes, things change. And what was right last month, last year, last decade, sometimes is overturned or modified or has nuances that change everything. To think you have the right answer at any given point in time on some very complex, polarizing issue, I think is naive in the extreme. So, and the older I get and the more experienced I get, the more I check myself and think, well, this is what we know about this subject right now, and this is how we understand it right now. And because of that, this is the suite of decisions I and others who are scientifically trained would recommend. One of the things that I really found inspirational was working with people who work in risk assessment and risk communication. When we made our film Jabbed, Love, Fear and Vaccines, I had the great honor of working with a scientist called Dr. Brian Zygmunt Fisher in the US. And he helped me understand how to boil a 90-minute film and literally, you know, thousands of plot points down to a single gist of an idea. He kept talking about the gist, G-I-S-T. And it took me a while to really get what he meant. But basically, he helped me see that around the vaccines conversation, that it was okay to be afraid of vaccines. That being fearful was normal. You're putting a needle into your own or child's arm, you know, with a substance you don't understand and a mechanism you don't fully understand. That it's okay to be afraid, but then what you do with that fear is the important thing. How you choose to act once you have information that helps deal with those fears. And so through Brian, I guess I learnt about really simple science communication. And the gist of it was, it's okay to be afraid, but now you have to decide what you're going to do with that fear. Now, that's a radical position to take when you're talking about science communication. The usual party position is to say vaccines are good for you. They're good for you for all these reasons, and this is why you should take them. So it was quite a radical notion to acknowledge the fear up front and then help people find ways to deal with that fear. So I'm forever grateful to Brian for helping me see that. And I've used that same technique now in many films since. And so yeah, that's one little story.